Witness what it's like to be a non-binary pregnant person and then a parent. Hello and welcome to I'm the Zaddy. Thank you for joining me on my brand new podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about why we chose IUI, what the testing process really looks like, and how I've been navigating the idea of being the one to carry as a non-binary person. Okay, so this is the point at which everything became real. Because up until now, building our family had only lived in conversations, questions, ideas, thoughts of how we were going to do it, how we were going to fund it, and how we were going to become the parents we wanted to be. And always coming back to maybe one day and when we get there, and being very future focused rather than how we're going to deal with it now. But ultimately we shifted into a space where we were ready to take that next step, to find out for real what it meant and how we really go about it. So after deciding that adoption wasn't really the right path for us, right now at least, we were left with the question of how we were going to actually grow our family. What were the real options and how were we actually going to get there? Like most people, I had assumptions. I assumed that things would just work. I assumed that our bodies would do what they are meant to do. And I assumed it would be fairly straightforward. And I think that's the thing, you don't really question any of that until you're in a position where it actually really matters. And where it is the difference between having a biological child or not having a biological child. Because before stepping into fertility treatment, we'd never really had to ask that question about, can we have a child this way? Can we get pregnant? You know, there was no whoopsies, no accidents occurring. And neither of us had experienced trying for a child before. So after talking to the GP and being referred to the fertility clinic, and having that initial consultation to run through absolutely everything, from procedures to funding, we started to look at the options for real, okay? And the options were IUI, IVF, shared motherhood, and not having kids at all. And let's be honest, if we picked that last option, this podcast wouldn't exist. But before we even stepped into the clinic, my partner knew she wanted to carry. And there was no hesitation from her and no hesitation from me either. And for me, it felt like a natural direction. It felt like something that was always meant to be. But also, if I'm being truly honest, it felt a bit of a relief for me. Because being non-binary, my relationship with my body is not straightforward. It's layered. It's not negative, but it's not simple either. But my partner carrying meant that I didn't have to face those challenges, face the mental and the physical changes and the hormones that would occur that if it was me to carry. Because I don't feel male or female, it meant that I didn't have to look inward to see what pregnancy would mean for me. But because I'm assigned female at birth, I still experience periods and boobs and body hair, and they've always been a challenge for me. And I can imagine that pregnancy would challenge me even further. So it felt like something much bigger. Something that I hadn't unpacked yet. But when I was younger, I very much wanted to experience pregnancy, but as I got older and got to know myself more, it wasn't something that I really focused on for me. I'd always assumed that I would be the second parent. I knew that I wanted a family, but I'd waited for the right person. I'd got to the point where I'd kind of said, if I don't meet that person, then I might not do it at all. But because my partner said that she wanted to carry, it felt like everything just slotted into place. So first we had to figure out our options. We'd seen the consultant. He told us what our options were. But the fact that my partner expressed a desire to carry meant that we'd got two options, IUI or IVF. But that was more of a direction than a decision, because before anything else could happen, we needed to answer a key question. Does everything work as it should? So during that consultation, they actually told us that we qualify for funding. due to the area that we live in and the BMI of my partner. So your BMI for the NHS to give you funding has to be 30 or below. So we got really lucky. And obviously my partner looking after herself was really good. But it is a postcard lottery, which is pretty unfair. But I know that it is getting better. We'd actually been saving like mad because we'd done the obligatory Google about the treatments and their costs and were prepared to spend a small fortune on growing our family because it is a small fortune. But finding out that we actually got funding was a huge relief because it meant that we could go into treatment, focus on the process, focused on how we were going to manage that emotional journey rather than looking at it financially. And then came the testing. This is where things started to become real and started to become questioned by everything and everyone. Because the testing isn't just information, it was confirmation as to whether my partner's body was going to do what we wanted it to do or not. So she went through the initial scans, checking her uterus, her ovaries, her follicle count, alongside a blood test, the AMH, which checks her egg reserve. This was the first time that we really kind of felt the pressure of whether things were going to go our way or not. So this was the first time our assumptions were actually being tested on whether she was viable to receive IUI treatment and whether it was a possible route for us to grow our family. We both believed that everything would be okay because we'd had no evidence to kind of prove us otherwise. But you start to wonder if it's not, or what happens if it's not, and how do we move forwards and how do we grow our family, and what if it's not what we hoped for. But the results came back and they were exactly what we hoped for. Healthy, viable, with absolutely no concerns. Amazing. So that meant that IUI was an option and was a valid route for us to grow our family. At that point, we kind of felt like we got away with assuming that everything worked. So my partner would carry and we could move into the next step, picking the donor. And then things changed. I'm not going to go into detail because it's not my story to tell, but we decided to switch. Not because my partner couldn't carry, but we decided it would be better if I did. So this is where things shifted. The moment we decided to switch felt incredibly scary for me. I wasn't sure how I felt in the moment, and it wasn't a quick and easy decision. We took a fair amount of time to think about it fully, months and months in fact. But as it sank in, I realised the fear and the anxiety, but also recognised the excitement and the challenge that it would be to me. And I accepted the change we were making, but also silently accepted that I had to overcome some things to move through this process. And I'm grateful to my past self for sorting out a therapist and not making any permanent changes to my body. So then we had to ask different questions. Not can we do this, but how does this work now? And does my body work in the way that we need it to? So it would be me carrying, challenging all those things I hadn't yet unpacked and looking at my inner thoughts about my body and the way I look and feel and the changes that would happen and the hormones I'd experienced getting pregnant and what all that would look like and how I would feel about myself and what other people would think about me being non-binary and being pregnant. But the key thing for me was that I was ready to start a family with my partner and ready to take on the challenge as a non-binary pregnant person. So we moved into testing again, but for me this time. Same process, same scans, same checks, plus one extra one called the Hycosy to check my tubes to make sure that they were clear and all good for IUI. The scans themselves were an interesting experience. The uterine the uterus and ovary scan was an internal one scan, which I'd never had before, and it wasn't the worst, but it's not something that I would want regularly. But you will learn through this podcast that it became a pretty frequent thing. The scan was a very female experience, but I assumed the role of patient in those instances to work through the testing as a process and tried not to get hung up on that pregnancy as a whole is a very female experience. And just because I don't feel female doesn't mean that I don't get to experience it. I guess the bonus is that I'm non-binary, but assigned female at birth means that I get to experience pregnancy even though I don't feel female. And I don't mean to say that I disconnected from myself or my identity in those moments, but instead of being disjointed or uncomfortable, I accepted these things were going to happen as part of the process for us to get where we want, to grow our family, and be pregnant, and have that tiny person as part of our life. The Hycosy was probably the worst part, but probably the most useful, because knowing whether your fallopian tubes are actually clear and IUI worthy is probably the best way to start the fertility journey. To begin with, the consultant actually suggested that we do 3 rounds of IUI, and then if it hasn't kind of taken those 3 rounds, then have the Hycosy, and then have the next 3, because you get 6 in total. But we talked about it and decided that actually what we'd like to do is give ourselves the best chance. So we actually did it before we even started IUI. So during the Hycosy, they basically use a wand again to scan you to know exactly where your tubes are and your ovaries are. But at the same time, they actually insert foam into sort of like the base of your fallopian tube to kind of see how far it goes into the ovary. Ultimately, to try and see whether it's clear or not. So they view it on screen, they can see how far the foam's gone, etc., etc. But the beautiful thing about this test is that they tell you there and then whether you're viable or whether you've got a problem. So thankfully, everything was perfect. So then I started looking at my body differently, asking what was it actually capable of, and can I get pregnant? Can I do this? And will it break me? Emotionally, the idea of me getting pregnant hit differently because there was no barriers in the way. We'd been ultimately signed off for IUI with everything, all the tests coming back perfect. So it became more about when we were going to start trying. And that felt really good, but also the scariest moment in my life. It wasn't about us in the same way anymore. It felt that there was a pressure almost on me. And I think that I built that up for myself, really. The idea of challenging myself, my gender, my identity, my relationship with my body, and ultimately the comfort in the grey that I live in. With pregnancy being such a gendered experience, and sort of looking at how I would go into appointments and feel those kind of pressures was a whole different kettle of fish for me. And I was no longer a passenger, ultimately. I was more in the driving seat to see whether things would work and see whether I could get pregnant and feel that. Pregnancy ultimately changes the way that you're seen in a clinical environment, how people speak to you, how people speak about you, how you're seen, and how people treat you, and not just those clinical people, but the people around you too. Even the randoms that you bump into in the supermarket, or people that offer you a seat when there isn't any other seat. Those things change, and those are all what feels like to me very gendered experiences. I kind of found myself asking, well, what does that mean for me? How does that work for me? Will I feel like me? Will it change me? Or will it kind of feel like something that doesn't quite fit anymore? Will it jar the whole way? Will I feel triggered the whole way? And also, will people call me mum? And how will that feel? You know, everything is built for women in this space. The groups, the classes, the advice, midwife appointments, the hospital appointments, the scans. Where do I fit? Will I fit? Will I feel pushed out in some way? Will I feel discomfort continuously? And do I correct strangers on my gender or just let it happen? Do I come out at every appointment? Do I tell people I'm non-binary at every single appointment I go to? Or do I just let it slip? These are all things that suddenly flooded my brain rather than concentrating on going through the process of IUI and getting pregnant. Already jumping the gun into what ifs and how would I deal with those things. But the problem with all of those questions is I didn't have the answers. And ultimately I wouldn't have the answers until I was in it. And so I sat with them for months and held them without knowing. But what I did realise was that I was open to finding out, and I wanted to find out. And I was ready for that challenge. Even though getting pregnant as a non-binary person felt complicated, it didn't feel wrong. And what felt really right was getting pregnant for me and my partner to grow our family. And that was enough for me to keep going. That was enough for me to go through the process and get pregnant and become a parent with my partner. The idea of me and my partner having a child together was more than enough for me to go through the process and challenge myself and experience all those changes and hormone shifts and identity shifts. So when my results came back and everything was perfect, it was a new version of the path forward. And honestly, it meant the world to both of us. We had our route forwards to grow our family, but now I would be the one carrying. And I think that's the biggest shift in all of this for me, not just practically, but internally, because we started off with a shared assumption that it would be my partner and I would be a second parent, witnessing her being pregnant and her having that experience. And it changed into something we both had to adapt to and mourn and grieve for, ultimately. And I guess I'm still working out what pregnancy means to me as a non-binary person. And I think I will be working that out all the way through. And I'm still trying to answer all those questions. So that brings this episode to a close. I hope you gained some insight, and if you have any questions or want to show your support, then please reach out. You can get in touch with me at getinTouch@imthezaddy.com, and you can follow me on Instagram at imthezaddy.pod. Thank you for listening, and I hope you join me next time. Peace.